On summer transfer deadline day, the Saudi Pro League went hell for leather in their pursuit of Liverpool's Mohamed Salah. An offer of more than £150 million from Al-Ittihad was rejected by the Reds, who reportedly ruled out selling Salah that window, even for a world record-breaking £215 million. Al-Ittihad were reported to have been willing to pay Salah £2.45 million a week, which also would have been a world record, plus a £55,000 win bonus and lucrative endorsement deals with 3 major Saudi state-owned companies. Liverpool refused to budge, Salah never forced the issue, and in the end, the Saudis ran out of time, with a strong suspicion that they would come back for Salah, who is undoubtedly the biggest football superstar in the Arab or Muslim world, in 2024. Though the Saudi Pro League had missed out on Salah, they were able to get over the line deadline day deals to sign Luis Felipe from Real Betis, Demarai Gray from Everton, and former Luton, Brentford, Burnley and Watford striker Andre Gray from Greek outfit Aris. Salah would have provided the finishing touches to a window which had seen the likes of Neymar, Karim Benzema, N'Golo Kante, Riyad Mahrez, Sadio Mane and Jordan Henderson join 5-time Ballon d'Or winner Cristiano Ronaldo in Saudi Arabia, as the Saudi Pro League outspent every other league in world football barring the Premier League, despite signing predominantly older players with less market value, and handed out a whole series of salaries that were, and still are, without precedent in the history of football. It was expected that in the January window, the Saudis would come again, if not necessarily for Salah, then for a litany of other superstars, including a possible loan move for Lionel Messi during the Major League Soccer off-season. Less than 5 months on from the league's last deadline day, in which they scrambled to sign one of the biggest names in world football for a record fee and wage, the Saudi Pro League's January window shut quietly earlier this week, on the same day that I turned 28, to about as much fanfare. For context, I went to a Turkish restaurant with my girlfriend, my mum brought me round a cake, and I contemplated the slow but incessant march towards my own death. There were no links with Salah or Messi this time around, or even the strata of players below that. In fact, only one player joined the Saudi Pro League for a fee this window, and that was Brazilian left-back Renan Lodi, who spent last season on loan at Nottingham Forest and joined Al Hilal from Marseille. There was one big-name deadline day arrival, namely that of a 35-year-old Ivan Rakitic, who joined Al-Shabab. Though even then, he was only replacing fellow veteran and former Sevilla star Eva Banega, who returned to Argentina. Arguably the biggest transfer involving the Saudi Pro League this window was actually Jordan Henderson, who left fellow former Liverpool captain Steven Gerrard's team Al-Ettifaq after less than 6 months, having successfully spread football around the globe and sullied his own reputation, so much so that he was booed by England fans in October at a friendly against Australia. All hail Hendo. Just you watch. I bet I'll have Dutch people interested in football before long. The man's a miracle worker. But why the sudden change in tact? It's not as though Saudi Arabia has run out of money, people are still buying oil. It's not as though it is mission accomplished in terms of improving Saudi Arabia's image or making domestic football more lucrative. Attendances at games and on television have fallen far short of many insiders' expectations. And it's not as though Saudi Arabia has halted investment in sport overall. The 2023 Riyadh season has seen the nation host high-profile boxing matches, tennis tournaments, and football Super Cups. Even there, though, there have been problems. Henderson, you see, isn't the only person to have been booed. At the 2023 Spanish Super Cup semi-final between Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid, fans booed and jeered during a minute's silence for Germany legend Franz Beckenbauer, prompting questions about whether the already under fire RFEF should really be hosting their tournament in Saudi Arabia solely for financial gain. Still, it could always have been worse. The 2023 Turkish Super Cup, also meant to have been held in Riyadh, had to be cancelled after the Saudi authorities denied Galatasaray and Fenerbahce's requests to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Turkey becoming a republic, leading to both teams refusing to play. Elsewhere, Karim Benzema, Roberto Firmino and Jota are all reportedly unhappy but were denied January moves elsewhere. One of the 4 PIF-owned clubs, Al-Ittihad, are in crisis. Aymeric Laporte has talked of widespread discontent among foreign players, and some Saudi Pro League players, despite being paid millions of dollars monthly by state-owned clubs, have chosen to live outside of Saudi Arabia and commute in for training and games. So just what on earth is going on? Well, that's a question that I've been asked a lot over the last month, which means, regrettably, that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on yet another journey to Saudi Arabia. I feel like we've been there more times than most diplomats and arms dealers over the last 12 months at this stage, as we take a look at why Saudi Pro League clubs were so quiet in the most recent January transfer window, why several big-name signings supposedly want to leave, and whether Saudi Arabia's football project really is already disintegrating, even faster than China's. Though there are undoubtedly some problems afoot for the Saudi Pro League, which we will obviously come on to, it's probably worth beginning by making the league's own case for them and acknowledging some of the understandable reasons why the January window was never likely to be as extreme as the summer one. For a start, Saudi Pro League teams signed Neymar and Benzema in the summer window, having already recruited Cristiano Ronaldo just over a year ago now. They also had failed in pursuits of Lionel Messi, Kylian Mbappe, and Mohamed Salah, none of whom ever seem likely to leave their current clubs mid-season, in Mbappe and Salah's case, or just 6 months into a 2.5-year contract in the case of Messi. From that level of ambition and investment, the only way was down, unless they could somehow convince Erling Haaland and Jude Bellingham to sacrifice their careers at 23 and 20, and even then, probably at a cost of about £1 billion for the pair of them. Then you've got simple regulatory issues. The Saudi Pro League may not be bound to any kind of financial fair play or profit and sustainability restrictions, and it is a good job, because they would fail all of them far more spectacularly than any club in the history of European football, but they still have some internal regulations. You may recall that when Al-Nassr signed Cristiano Ronaldo, in what was really the first blockbuster Saudi Pro League signing, and is arguably still the biggest, it resulted in Cameroon captain Vincent Aboubakar being forced out. Aboubakar in fact volunteered to leave the club following Ronaldo's arrival from Manchester United, but only because he was aware of the Saudi Pro League's foreign player quota, which meant that one of Al-Nassr's foreign players would have to be offloaded to make way for the Portuguese superstar, and he probably assumed that, as a forward, it was likely to be him. Al-Nassr reportedly weren't that keen on getting rid of Aboubakar, and even enlisted Ronaldo's help in an effort to convince him to stay, but by then the damage had already been done. Aboubakar subsequently rejoined Besiktas for his third stint at the club, though he was excluded from the squad in December for poor performance, along with Eric Bailly and Jean Onana. The Saudi Pro League allows for a maximum of 8 foreign players in every team squad, plus an extra spot for foreign nationals who were born in Saudi Arabia, and following such a wild summer spending spree, many clubs are at that limit. In fact, every club other than ABBA, who are down to 7, having lost Cameroon duo Devis Apassi and Kartoko Akambi, and Iraqi Saad Natik this season, are at the maximum number of 8, and roughly half have more than 8. If you're wondering how that works, well, just as in the Premier League, if you have more than the number of registrable players, or players eligible to be registered, you have to leave some of them out of your squad. Saudi Pro League teams have ended up in a situation where former Leeds United star Ezcan Alioski is unregistered at Al Ahly, Sweden's Robin Kazan is unregistered at Al Ettifaq, Neymar is out in the cold due to his ACL injury at Al Hilal, Englishman Mo Adams can't yet be registered for Al Khalij despite having only just joined them, former Dutch wonderkid Adam Mar is off the books at Damac, and, most remarkably of all, Al Ettifaq have 2 players who are currently unregistered as a result of Al Ettifaq having 10 foreign players in their current squad, plus Egyptian national Nuruddin Al-Bahar, who was born in Saudi Arabia and is therefore able to be registered. That means that in order to sign any foreign players whatsoever, Saudi Pro League teams, with the sole exception of ABBA now, must sell 1 or more of their foreign players first. Buying and selling players is, of course, part and parcel of football for all clubs. but it becomes increasingly difficult when you're paying an aging player 4, 5, 6, heck, even 10 times as much as they could possibly hope to earn anywhere else. Most of you watching this can probably think of a player that your club has signed on a lot of money where it hasn't quite worked out, but because of their salaries, it has proved very difficult to shift them. The most famous, or infamous example perhaps, is surely Winston Bogarde, who played 9 Premier League games in 4 years at Chelsea, and I think none in his last 3, but refused to leave the club because no one else would offer him anything like the what was then an extortionate £40,000 a week that he was on. A similar problem ultimately led to Leicester City's relegation last season. The Foxes, much like several Saudi clubs, had a bloated squad which prevented them from registering any new players, and while they had lots of interest in all of their best players, who they were desperate to keep, they had next to no interest in their squad players, often on significantly inflated salaries, who would fail to perform. It prevented Leicester from being able to operate in the transfer market. Backup goalkeeper Alex Smithies was their only summer arrival prior to the start of last season, until centre-back Wout Faes joined from Rennes on deadline day. And that was it, despite the £75 million sale of Wesley Fofana to Chelsea. It's a problem at all clubs to a degree, unless they have absolutely flawless recruitment, but for Saudi Pro League clubs, it's like Leicester City last season, which was itself a fairly extreme example, but on so many steroids that it could win the Tour de France. Forget the fact that the Saudi Pro League is a league and people compete in the Tour de France, not leagues. You're overthinking the analogy, alright? The point being, it's like that, but a lot worse. Of course, in order to tempt players to Saudi Arabia, an arid desert nation with little domestic football pedigree, a league which is ranked below some second tiers in Europe, and one of the most authoritarian and repressive states in the world, the Saudis didn't just have to offer players a little bit more money than they could earn in more hospitable countries and competitive leagues, but far, far, far more. Forget about Ronaldo, Neymar and Benzema, who the Saudi state have made the 3 highest paid players on the planet, with Benzema increasing his €28 million a year salary at Real Madrid to a reported €120 million a year deal at Al-Nassr. It is the players below them who are almost more remarkable, and more relevant in this context at least. Just take Seko Fofana, the Ivory Coast midfielder, who joined Al-Nassr from Lens in the summer, but moved on again in the January window, joining fellow Saudi Pro League side Al-Nassr under Steven Gerrard instead. Fofana earns a reported €15.2 million a season in Saudi Arabia, which is about £250,000 or $315,000 a week. That is more than Bernardo Silva and Rodri, 2 of the best midfielders in the world, earn at Manchester City, albeit Silva was reportedly offered £500,000 a week to move to Saudi Arabia in the summer but turned it down. Say, for example, that Al-Nassr, who are one of the big 4 directly PIF-owned Saudi Pro League clubs, wanted to offload a foreign player in order to free up an extra foreign player slot, and Fofana was the player that they decided to get rid of. Seriously, who on earth is going to sign him? Fofana is probably on 5 times what he earns at Lens, at least twice, if not 3 times as much, as he could hope to earn anywhere outside of Saudi Arabia, and that's before you even get into the €25 million fee that Al-Nassr paid just 6 months ago, and which no one would now pay for the 28-year-old. That is exactly what happened with Fofana, with the solution being to loan him to Al-Nassr, who had an additional foreign player slot open up, after Jordan Henderson forced his way out of the club after just 6 months. Essentially, the Saudi Pro League has just shifted the burden of Fofana, who isn't a bad player by the way, he is a very good one, he's just never worth £250,000 a week and didn't seem to fit in at Al-Nassr from one club to another. Because no team outside of Saudi Arabia, without access to Saudi state resources and the motives of the Saudi state to invest such ludicrous sums of money into the sport, would touch him with a 10-foot pole. Unless, as in the case of Henderson, the player themselves is so determined to leave that they are willing to take a massive pay cut in order to move elsewhere. Of course, even when players do want to leave, there are few instances in which they're going to be prepared to do just that. And so you end up in the situation that the Saudi Pro League currently finds itself in, just 6 months on from the league's wild spending spree, lumbered with a whole load of players who, whether they are happy in Saudi Arabia and whether their clubs are happy with them, are near enough impossible to shift. Funnily enough, this was previously the case with some of these exact same players before the Saudi Pro League exploded onto the scene. Chelsea would have found it near enough impossible to offload a 32-year-old Kalidou Koulibaly for nothing when he was on £160,000 a week last summer, let alone the £17 million that they received for him from Al Hilal. Fabinho moved around the Liverpool midfield with all of the guile, energy and agility of a wardrobe last season, and it is doubtful that anyone else would have matched or exceeded the £180,000 a week that he earns at Liverpool, and Bayern Munich would have run into similar difficulties offloading former Red Star Sadio Mane following a disappointing debut campaign at the Allianz Arena when he was on an enormous reported £320,000 a week. We saw the exact same thing with the Chinese Super League. Though it was often portrayed as being a challenger league or as a threat to Europe's elite, and there were one or two jitters within boardrooms when Alex Teixeira chose Jiangsu Suning ahead of both Liverpool and Chelsea, in reality, by and large at least, it was actually a net positive for top European teams and leagues. Once again, no one else would have paid Chelsea more than £50 million for Oscar were it not for Xi Jinping and the CCP greenlighting enormous Chinese investments in football. And not many clubs other than Guangzhou Evergrande would have been falling over themselves to take Paulinho off Tottenham's hands after he fell so far short of expectations in his debut campaign in North London. So, the difficulty of moving on players they've already signed, who perhaps haven't worked out, is one problem, as is the cap on foreign players. Except, of course, for the fact that the reason there's no FFP or PNS in Saudi Arabia is because they control their own internal markets and regulations, and, for obvious reasons, they don't want any spending or loss regulations, because almost all of their clubs are currently spending and losing mounds of cash. And that is all part of the plan. If they wanted to increase their foreign player quota, therefore, from 8 to 10 or even from 8 to 12 players, just as they have increased it from 4 to 8 since the 2016-17 season, in order to facilitate a whole raft of new big money and big name acquisitions, they very easily could. In some ways then, their argument only kicks the can down the road. So why haven't they? Well, there are a few hypotheses. One is that Saudi Arabia's mass investment in football was all centred around the desire to host the FIFA World Cup, and with that now safely in the bag, that sense of urgency has largely subsided. Qatar paid the likes of Zinedine Zidane and then Barcelona boss Pep Guardiola millions of dollars for endorsements in the build-up to their 2022 World Cup bid, and most famously, David Beckham received a reported $180 million to become the country's ambassador for the next 10 years ahead of the tournament, with a particular focus on the World Cup, which needed all of the promotion and good press that it could get its hands on, following FIFA's corruption scandal and numerous exposés on the treatment and conditions of migrant workers. Not this migrant worker, his paying conditions were excellent. These ones, not so much. Saudi Arabia felt they could kill two government critics with one executioner's sword, to coin an old phrase, by bringing players to the Saudi Pro League with either an explicit agreement to promote the country's host credentials and the future tournament, or merely an implied one. You don't have to be Detective Poirot to figure out that was the case, when basically every big-name Saudi Pro League signing had a carefully choreographed promo message scheduled to be uploaded within minutes of Saudi Arabia announcing their official bid to host the 2034 World Cup. My particular favourite came courtesy of Karim Benzema, who is rumoured to be being paid €20 million a year to promote Saudi Arabia's prospective World Cup, on top of his €100 million a year playing contract, who quote-tweeted the Saudi Football Federation's announcement and wrote, and when I say he wrote, I am really stretching the meaning of those words to breaking point, quote, "Wow, amazing news! The future is bright. Congrats to all my friends and fans in Saudi Arabia on this big announcement. I know how much you love the game and what this would mean to you. It would be an incredible FIFA World Cup. Hashtag Saudi 2034. End quote. What a heartfelt and touching message from someone who just earnestly wants Saudi Arabia to host the World Cup. It has been a lifelong ambition of his to make it happen. The €20 million a year is just a bonus. The real motivation is because he knows how much they love the game. Didn't you hear the man? I especially enjoyed the opening. Wow, amazing news. As if it has come as a great shock to him that the country paying his wages, plus €20 million a year to promote their World Cup, has bid to host the World Cup. Wow, amazing news. Whoever could have foreseen such a shocking turn of events? That is enough dunking on Benzema, for now at least. Mahrez and Gerrard's tweets or Instagram posts were no less embarrassing. Old Stevie went with, and again I use those words loosely, incredible to think that the 11-year journey to a home FIFA World Cup might have already started for some of my youth players. Hard work starts now. Clapping emoji, Saudi Arabia flag, hashtag Saudi 2034. End quote. You can tell that those weren't Gerrard's own words because at no point did he say, yeah, of course, 3 out of 10, must try harder. The point being, however, that Saudi Arabia has got their World Cup now, and they have got it unopposed. Unlike their initial 2030 World Cup bid as one of 3 co-hosts, by dropping their bid to co-host in 2030, which they should never really have been eligible to do under FIFA rules, but we will just skip over that for now, FIFA gave Saudi Arabia a clear run at hosting in 2034 on their own, effectively rigging the process so no one else could challenge them, and making it fairly clear that it would be pointless to do so anyway, because FIFA had already made their decision. I can buy that, having bought the right to host the World Cup unopposed, the sense of urgency among Mohammed bin Salman and his inner circle to sign part players, part ambassadors on exorbitant salaries may have somewhat waned. After all, they've got all the paid-up ambassadors recruited over the last 12 months, so what's the rush to add any more with the World Cup already in the bag and over 10 years into the future? The fact that Saudi Arabia's World Cup is over 10 years away, however, also surely adds a desire to make the Saudi Pro League project a long-term one. Over the next 10 years, Saudi Arabia is going to have to build 10 state-of-the-art new football stadiums, all with capacities in excess of 40,000 and at least some over 60 and 80,000, as well as renovating a further 4 to bring them up to FIFA requirements, in order to give them 14 venues capable of hosting games at a FIFA World Cup. Following the Qatar fiasco and the persistent problem of World Cup venues becoming white elephants once the month-long show leaves town, FIFA mandated that host nations must have at least 7 existing suitable stadiums and could only build a further 7. Those rules were very quietly changed, very conveniently for Saudi Arabia, with that requirement falling from 7 to 4 existing stadiums to seamlessly pave the way for a successful Saudi bid. Saudi Arabia isn't a microstate like Qatar though. While Qatar's bogus proposals to repurpose or donate parts or whole stadiums, as we recently covered on this channel in some depth, have yet to and seem unlikely to ever substantively come true, Saudi Arabia is a nation of around 36 million people, over half of whom are under the age of 25. I think this is really the crux of why Saudi Arabia has invested so much money in football, at least as much as it has to do with cleansing the nation's image overseas, or sports washing, establishing it as a regional superpower and a global mid-sized power, and, as MBS recently claimed, increasing GDP by between 1 to 2%. Young people, particularly young men, and especially when you have a growing educated population and a disenfranchised elite who are excluded from the halls of power, is the most significant determinant of the likelihood of revolution and the toppling of regimes. Saudi Arabia sits almost perfectly in that sweet spot in terms of demographics for revolution, which is why the House of Saud has always been terrified by revolutions on its doorstep, whether that be in Egypt, Yemen, or most notably Iran. Saudi Arabia's investment in not just football but a whole raft of sports, football just being the most significant and expensive of them, is almost certainly motivated at least in part by a desire to quell disquiet and dissatisfaction among the country's young male population, In addition to encouraging them to become more active, as Saudi Arabia has a big problem with teenage and young adult obesity and other health-related issues. I've covered all of this in much more detail in a previous Saudi Arabia video, but of course, it is relevant when asking why spending has slowed down to consider why it began in the first place and to assess the long-term viability of the overall project. I think that it's unlikely, therefore, that Saudi Arabia will abandon or abort their football project to the same extent as China did between 2019 and 2021, just 5 years after it began, or at least that they will do so before hosting the 2034 World Cup, which will almost certainly cost in excess of $100 billion. Again, this is a point that I have made in the past, but there is this perception that Saudi Arabia is the richest country known to man and has endless resources. In reality, it has a GDP of a little over $800 billion, which is less than half the size of Australia's GDP, a country with 10 million fewer people, and therefore almost 3 times the GDP per capita. Qatar spent an estimated $220 billion hosting the 2022 World Cup, when all related infrastructure, transport projects, and bribes are taken into account. That is almost exactly the same as Saudi Arabia's total annual oil exports, $224 billion, upon which the country is practically entirely dependent. The 2034 World Cup will be on a much larger scale due to the increased tournament size and format, meaning that Saudi Arabia will have to build 6 more stadiums than Qatar, and the cost may well be even greater for them. Even if we say that it will only cost the same, it seems improbable that the House of Saud would allocate that degree of funds to hosting a month-long football tournament without having a long-term strategy in place for the sport. Of course, it is possible that long-term strategy may well just entail more moderation than Saudi Arabia's initial investment in football. I mean, it could hardly entail any less, and that, even at this stage, Saudi Arabia could already be contemplating a change of tact. It's no secret that attendances in the Saudi Pro League haven't risen as hoped following the arrival of so many big-name players for such exorbitant fees, which is a problem when one of your primary motives is to engage young people, or even just from an economic standpoint. There are lots of reasons for those low attendances, from the disparity in levels of support for big and small teams, and the culture that exists around attending games, through to poor infrastructure and extreme heat, as I covered in an entire video dedicated to that exact topic. But whatever the cause, it is an issue. Likewise, global interest in the league has been, at best, underwhelming. Saudi Arabia has had great success in bringing eyeballs to the country in a way that it can manipulate and gaining instant results in sports like boxing, MMA, Formula 1 and golf. Football isn't like other sports though. Most of the people who would pay to watch Anthony Joshua fight Tyson Fury in London will still pay to watch Anthony Joshua fight Tyson Fury in Riyadh. Most of the people who would watch Gabriel Martinelli and Dejan Kulusevski in London, namely Arsenal and Spurs fans, but also football and Premier League fans more broadly, won't still watch Gabriel Martinelli and Dejan Kulusevski if they join Al Hilal and Al-Nassr and start playing in Riyadh instead. Football just doesn't work like that. Fans are attached to clubs more so than players, there is a whole ecosystem within which teams and leagues exist, and the sport is so popular and has such deep attachment to so many people throughout the world that it is impossible to ever concentrate it in a single destination or on a single competition, as the Saudis have been able to do in a sport like golf. In short, the Saudis have spent an awful lot of money on football and they have so far got very little in return, so it would hardly be shocking if they were re-evaluating their strategy and their options, and were therefore a little bit more reserved and apprehensive in the January transfer window. The focus on hosting tournaments, whether that be the AFC Champions League Elite, the FIFA Club World Cup, or the domestic Super Cup of literally any football association in need of a bit of cash, hasn't wavered at all, along with Saudi Arabia's more fruitful investment in other sports and indeed the Premier League club Newcastle United. The elephant in the room here is that the lack of arrivals to the Saudi Pro League in the January window wasn't entirely the decision of Saudi Pro League clubs themselves. In several instances, it would appear that there was substantive interest in players, and even bids accepted which progressed to personal terms being discussed, only for the players in question to turn the opportunity down. Al-Ittihad, for example, reportedly had a €30 million bid for Argentina under-20 international Matías Soulé accepted by Juventus. Al-Ittihad hoped that the opportunity to play under Argentina legend Marcelo Gallardo, who manages the club, would be enough to clinch the deal, along with an enormous salary, which genuinely would have been life-changing at this stage for the 20-year-old. Soulé turned it down though, choosing to see out the rest of what has so far been an outstanding loan spell at Frosinone, wanting to focus on his development and realise his ambition in football first and foremost. Soulé isn't alone. Nabil Fekir, Hakan Çalhanoğlu, and Anthony Martial were all reportedly offered and turned down approaches from Saudi clubs in the January window. Meanwhile, Jose Mourinho was apparently offered the Al-Shabaab job after getting sacked at Roma, but also said no. It's no secret that there is a discontent among some of the players who have already moved to Saudi Arabia, and footballers talk to one another. If you're 50-50 about making such a radical career and life decision, and a former teammate who has gone out there sows a few seeds of doubt in your mind, that is probably likely to swing your decision against the move. Jordan Henderson is obviously the most well-documented case as the first really high-profile and enormously well-paid player to have prematurely called time upon his stint in Saudi Arabia, but he's not alone in having caught cold feet. Former Celtic star and treble winner Jota has perhaps had the most unfortunate time of all. Almost as soon as he arrived at Al-Ittihad for a club record £25 million, it seemed as though he was out in the cold, left out of the squad to make room for other foreign players. There were rumours that his compatriot and head coach, Nuno Espirito Santo, never wanted to sign him, and the fiasco surrounding Jota is just one of a series of crises at the circus that has been Al-Ittihad this season. Despite signing the likes of Kante, Fabinho, and Ballon d'Or winner Karim Benzema in the summer as one of the big four PIF-owned teams, adding them to a team that literally won the Saudi Pro League last season, Al-Ittihad currently find themselves down in 7th in the table, below Damak, a club who average fewer than 5,000 fans at their home games so far this season. Jota unsurprisingly wanted out then, having only played 133 minutes of football in the Saudi Pro League all season, and looks set for a deadline day move to West Ham. At the final minute though, Al-Ittihad boss Marcelo Gallardo, who replaced Nuno Espirito Santo in November, changed his mind, decided to register Jota, and pulled the plug on the deal. Benzema himself, one of the league's marquee signings, has had his issues in Saudi Arabia as well. He was reported not to have got on with Nuno Espirito Santo, and despite making 17 goal contributions in 20 games since arriving from Real Madrid, Benzema has been criticised by locals for his performances, which it has been speculated is the reason why he both deleted his Instagram account and didn't show up to mid-season training. It's no secret that Benzema was keen on returning to Europe during the January window and has been unhappy with his start to life at Al-Ittihad. Though he was linked with the likes of Arsenal and Chelsea, Benzema was reportedly told that he could only move internally to another Saudi club, so he chose to stay put. Elsewhere, Roberto Firmino has been dropped at Al Ahly, despite being club captain, and was reportedly keen on a January exit. Firmino's agent reportedly touted his services to Chelsea, Fulham and, perhaps somewhat ambitiously, Real Madrid, with the firmest interest ultimately coming from Sheffield United. But Al Ahly refused to entertain any offers, and Firmino didn't choose to force their hand. Aymeric Laporte told Spanish newspaper AS, quote, "They have not made it easy for us. In fact, there are many players that are discontented. We are working on it every day, negotiating so to speak, and to see if it improves a little because this is something new for them too, having European players who already have a long career. Maybe they are not used to this and have to adapt to a little more seriousness." Adding, "In terms of quality of life, I expected something different because, in the end, here you spend 3 hours a day in the car. Riyadh is a waste of traffic, of time wasted in the car." End quote. When Laporte's comments were shared on social media, he responded with a cross emoji, suggesting either that he felt they weren't fully reflective of what he had said or had been taken out of context, or that the league had caught wind of them and had told him to issue some kind of a retraction. It is hard to come out and say, actually, I was lying, I've never been stuck in traffic in Riyadh, which is presumably why Laporte just issued a cross-in response. Of course, Saudi Arabia is one of the strictest, most repressive, conservative, and authoritarian countries in the world. It is hardly surprising that players moving there from Spain, England, and France, and particularly those who have only ever lived in relatively free Western countries, should find it a little bit difficult to adapt. You're probably thinking of the prohibition on alcohol or the strict rules relating to women's dress when I say something like that. But the biggest hurdle for foreign footballers in Saudi Arabia has in fact been the country's restrictions on living arrangements. It is a crime in Saudi Arabia for unmarried couples to live together, or for women to get pregnant or have children outside of marriage, and there are no exceptions for foreigners on work visas. Well, except for one exception, it would seem. Cristiano Ronaldo and his partner Georgina Rodriguez aren't married. They have 5 children, 2 from Georgina, and 3 from Ronaldo's previous relationships and through surrogacy, and they live together in Riyadh. Of course, that should see them arrested and thrown in jail, but it has been widely reported that, as part of his record-breaking move to the kingdom, Ronaldo and Rodriguez were seemingly exempted from a law that applies to everyone else. That has caused some tension among unmarried Saudi Pro League players who are also in relationships, whose partners have instead, in some instances it is reported, chosen to live in Dubai alongside the players in question, who only spend time in Saudi Arabia for matches and training. An even more radical solution, adopted by former Liverpool captain Steven Gerrard and previously Jordan Henderson before his early departure, is just to live in an entirely different country and only commute into Saudi Arabia. Gerrard and previously Henderson had made home in Manama, the capital of Bahrain, a small island kingdom connected to Saudi Arabia by the King Fahd Causeway, or alternatively, by a short helicopter ride. Bahrain has much more relaxed laws relating to things like alcohol, cohabitation and civil liberties, providing less of a culture shock to Western players. Their children attend local British schools, there is the local Bahrain Rugby Club with a clubhouse which serves alcohol, and plenty of high-end restaurants inside of hotels like the Ritz-Carlton and the Four Seasons. There has been no official comment from the Saudi government or Saudi Pro League officials as to these living arrangements, but it's not exactly a great look, is it? If you're investing billions in sports and signing some of the biggest names in world football on literally the biggest contracts in the entire history of the sport, at least in part as a propaganda exercise to promote your country's image and its reputation for trade and tourism, what kind of message does it send when people who the government is paying tens of millions of pounds refuse to even live there? It's a bit of a PR own goal, which is probably why no players have gone public about it, at least beyond vaguely alluding to it. It's also, perhaps, why Cristiano Ronaldo, who appears to quite literally be above the law in Saudi Arabia, as though he were now actually a member of the ruling House of Saud, has become the league's biggest cheerleader, claiming that life in Riyadh and the region is incredible, and that the standard of football in the Saudi Pro League is better than the standard in Ligue 1. A comment which, if you looked very closely, you could actually see his nose grow slightly when he said it. In fairness to Ronaldo, he might have meant League 1, the third tier of English football, though even there, you don't get crowds of just a few hundred. Others, meanwhile, who have been afforded fewer privileges beyond the headline wages, have been a little bit more reserved. Ronaldo, incidentally, before moving into a mansion in Riyadh, lived at the Four Seasons Hotel. I say incidentally there because I once stayed at a Four Seasons hotel in Cyprus. I didn't pay for it, of course, where one floor of the hotel had been entirely booked out by a Saudi prince and member of the House of Saud, which was visible from my balcony on the floor above. I feel well placed, therefore, to speak to the fact that the form of Salafism and Wahhabism promoted by Saudi Arabia and the strict form of Sharia implemented by the state isn't necessarily adhered to by all of the nation's rulers. Make no mistake, rules for thee but not for me as an adage is far from exclusive to Saudi elites. In fact, I would say that it's the norm almost everywhere in the world, but it feels that little bit more pointed and warped when some of those supposed misdeeds that you're guilty of can result in your own citizens quite literally being beheaded. You know, it was bad when Boris Johnson partied through lockdown with impunity, while students got £10,000 fines for doing the exact same thing. Really bad. But I think we can all agree that it would have been even worse if those same students had instead been executed. Former Chelsea director of football under Roman Abramovich, Michael Emenalo, who is now the sports director of the entire Saudi Pro League, has dismissed the idea that any players are unhappy with the standard of football, training, or their living conditions and the culture shock in Saudi Arabia, implying that it is a narrative being spun by people trying to undermine the league. Of course, in some instances, we know that isn't true. Emenalo also claimed, for example, that Jordan Henderson was happy at Al-Ettifaq and had no intention whatsoever of leaving Saudi Arabia before his contract expired, about 3 weeks before Henderson left Al-Ettifaq to join Ajax. That's not to say that everyone's in the same boat. There have only really been substantive reports about maybe 6 or 7 players being genuinely unhappy in Saudi Arabia and seeking moves elsewhere. And though Laporte spoke of widespread discontent, it is unclear how many players he actually spoke on behalf of. Out of almost 150 foreign players, you could argue that's not all that bad, if we are to assume that those who haven't spoken out or voiced any grievances publicly don't have any whatsoever. I think that it is unlikely that the Saudi Pro League will collapse with the same ferocity and speed as the Chinese Super League did 3 or 4 years ago. For a start, though far from outstanding, the Saudi national team is stronger than China's, and the country's domestic player pool is able to prop up the league as a sort of third-rate global league on their own, in a way that China's wasn't. That, perhaps, is also a reason why Saudi Arabia are reluctant to slash all restrictions on the number of foreign players in the league in an attempt to safeguard domestic development and the future prospects of the national team, now managed by Roberto Mancini, and also in a bit of a crisis after Mancini exiled 3 of the national team's star players before KSA were dumped out of the Asian Cup in the round of 16 stage, but that is a whole other meltdown for a whole other occasion. It is more likely, I think, that Saudi Arabia is assessing its options. The country has been successful in buying a World Cup, something that China never managed, but less successful in increasing crowds, television audiences, and hoovering up market share as they have been able to do much more easily and effectively in other less popular sports. There are numerous hurdles which, although Saudi Arabia may be very gradually liberalising, many foreign players are always likely to find it difficult to adjust to, though it is hard to know what they expected. Just sort of Googling Saudi Arabia laws perhaps would have been a good start, or maybe they just assumed that the Ronaldo exemptions would apply to them all. Anyhow, that is my long, rambling Saudi Arabia update. I hope that it is the last one for a while, but the number of requests reached a breaking point and left me with little choice but to make it. Hopefully you all enjoyed it or found it somewhat interesting or informative. Hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel and for my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram or Threads by the username at HITC Sevens on all 3, and all of that information plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.